The morning sun glinted off the gold buttons of his scarlet tunic as he stood perfectly still outside Buckingham Palace. His black boots shone like mirrors, reflecting the faces of tourists who snapped photos and pointed. This was just another day for Thomas Wilson, but the path that brought him here was anything but ordinary. Growing up in South London wasn't easy for Thomas. His mum worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table after his dad left when he was just 8 years old. Their flat was small, the neighborhood rough, but his mum made sure he stayed in school and out of trouble. "You're going to be somebody special," she'd tell him every night before bed. Those words stuck with him, even on the hardest days. As a boy, Thomas once saw the Royal Guards during a school trip to London. He stood mesmerized by their discipline, their pride. The teacher had to call his name 3 times to get him to rejoin the group. That night, he told his mum, "I'm going to wear that uniform someday." She smiled and ruffled his hair. "Then you better start standing straight now." The other kids laughed when he shared his dream. "People like us don't become Royal Guards," his best friend told him. Thomas understood what he meant without having to ask. There weren't many black faces in those prestigious uniforms. But Thomas was stubborn. Every morning, he practiced standing at attention in front of his bedroom mirror. He joined the school's military cadet program. He studied hard, knowing he'd need proper qualifications. At 18, he enlisted in the army, determined to prove himself. Military life tested him in ways he never imagined. The physical challenges, endless drills, marches through mud and rain, learning to function on minimal sleep, those he could handle. It was the subtle looks, the occasional comments, the feeling of having to work twice as hard to be considered half as good that wore on him. His commanding officer, a stern man from Yorkshire, pulled him aside after a particularly grueling exercise. "Wilson, why'd you join up?" Thomas stood straight. "To serve my country, sir." "Your country," the officer repeated, studying Thomas's face. "Good answer. Remember that when things get tough. This uniform belongs to you as much as anyone else." Those words carried Thomas through the years that followed. He rose through the ranks, earning respect through sheer determination and excellence. When the opportunity came to apply for the Royal Guard, he didn't hesitate. The selection process was brutal. Only the best soldiers made it through. Thomas pushed himself beyond what he thought possible. When the final list was posted and he saw his name, he didn't celebrate immediately. He stood there, staring at the paper, thinking of his mum who hadn't lived to see this day, thinking of all the people who said he couldn't do it. Now, at 28, Thomas stood outside the palace, his face a perfect mask of discipline. 6 months into his posting, he had mastered the art of stillness, of appearing like a living statue while remaining alert to everything around him. Tourists often tried to make him smile or blink. Children waved. Adults posed beside him for photos. Thomas saw everything but reacted to nothing. This wasn't just a job to him. It was the fulfillment of a promise, to himself, to his mum, to the boy he once was who dared to dream beyond his circumstances. Little did he know that in just a few hours, his training would be tested in a way no drill sergeant could have prepared him for. An ordinary shift was about to become an extraordinary moment that would change not just his life, but the lives of many others. The crowd began to thicken as noon approached. Among the sea of faces and cameras, Thomas noticed a man moving differently from the others, unsteady, agitated, heading straight toward his post. The men stumbled forward, pushing past a family taking photos. Thomas could smell the alcohol from 10 feet away. The man's face was red, his shirt untucked, and his eyes had that unfocused look of someone who'd been drinking since breakfast. "Look at this," the man slurred, pointing at Thomas. "They're letting anyone wear the uniform these days." A few tourists turned to stare. A woman pulled her children closer to her. Thomas remained still, eyes focused straight ahead, just as his training demanded. The palace grounds were always full of people saying all sorts of things. Ignoring them was part of the job. But the man wasn't finished. His name was Robert Thornton, though Thomas wouldn't learn this until much later. Right now, he was just another face in the crowd, albeit one that was getting too close. I said, "Look at this." Thornton raised his voice, drawing more attention. "My grandfather died protecting the king, and now they've got you standing here. Where are you even from?" Thomas's finger twitched slightly against the rifle he held, the only sign that he'd heard anything at all. Around him, the crowd had gone quiet. People were watching, uncomfortable, uncertain what to do. A young woman stepped forward. "Sir, please leave him alone. He's doing his job." Thornton spun around. "Did I ask you?" Then he turned back to Thomas, moving closer until he was just a few feet away. The guards weren't supposed to be approached this closely. Thomas's training kicked in, assessed the threat, looked for weapons, determined intent. Thornton didn't appear armed, just angry and drunk. Still dangerous, but not in a way that justified breaking formation. "You don't belong here," Thornton continued, his words slurring together. "My family's been British for 15 generations. What about yours? Bet you can't even trace back 3. A man in the crowd shouted, "That's enough. Leave him alone." But Thornton was in his own world now, emboldened by alcohol and the attention. "They put you here for the tourists, right? Like some kind of show? Diversity hire, that's what you are." Thomas's mind flashed back to his childhood bedroom, standing at attention in front of his mirror. To his mother working late shifts to buy his first uniform for cadets. To his commanding officer telling him he belonged in this uniform as much as anyone. The insults continued for what felt like forever. 6 minutes by the clock in the courtyard, though it seemed much longer. Thomas counted his breaths, keeping them even. His training had prepared him for physical threats, but this was different. This cut deeper than any punch could. Around him, phones were out. People were recording. Thomas knew that anything he did now would be seen by thousands, maybe millions. His responsibility wasn't just to himself, but to the uniform, to every person who would wear it after him. A small boy in the crowd tugged at his mother's sleeve. Why is that man being mean to the guard? The guard didn't do anything wrong. The mother bent down and whispered something in the boy's ear. The boy looked at Thomas with wide eyes, then back at the angry man, trying to make sense of what was happening. Thornton noticed the child watching and seemed to grow more agitated. "You see this?" he shouted, gesturing wildly at Thomas. "They want your children to think this is normal, that anyone can just walk in and—" That's when Thomas's commanding officer appeared, walking briskly across the courtyard. Lieutenant Parker had been monitoring the situation through security cameras and decided it had gone on long enough. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step back," Parker said firmly, positioning himself between Thomas and Thornton. "Oh, here we go," Thornton sneered. The babysitters arrived. "Sir, you're causing a disturbance at a royal residence. I must ask you to move along, or you'll be escorted from the grounds." Thornton swayed slightly, looking from the lieutenant to Thomas. The crowd watched in tense silence. This was the moment that could go either way. Thornton could back down, or things could get worse. Thomas remained perfectly still, but inside, something was shifting. For the first time in his career as a royal guard, he was considering breaking protocol, not to react with anger, but to respond in a way that might actually make a difference. He made his decision. Lieutenant Parker stood firmly between Thomas and Thornton, his back straight and his voice calm but commanding. "Sir, this is your final warning. Please step back and leave the grounds." Thornton laughed, a harsh sound that cut through the tense air. "Or what? You'll have your diversity hire here arrest me." The crowd had grown larger now. People who had been walking by stopped to watch. Some looked uncomfortable, others angry, and a few were still filming everything on their phones. Inside his perfectly still body, Thomas's mind was racing. 6 years in the military had taught him how to stay calm under pressure. But this was different from anything he faced before. This wasn't about physical danger, it was about something deeper. His thoughts drifted to his grandfather, who had come to England on a ship from Jamaica in the 1950s. He had faced worse than this every day, yet still spoke of Britain with pride and hope. "This country isn't perfect," he used to tell Thomas, "but it can be better tomorrow than it is today, if good people stand up for what's right." Thomas could almost hear his grandfather's voice now, mixing with the memory of his mother saying, "There's always a choice in how you respond, even when it feels like there isn't." The rules were clear. Royal Guards did not break formation except for security threats. They did not speak. They did not react. They represented something larger than themselves, centuries of tradition, the dignity of the crown, the face of Britain to the world. But what good was representing Britain if he couldn't represent the best of what Britain could be? Thomas caught the eye of the little boy who had asked his mother why the man was being mean. The child was still watching, his eyes wide with confusion and curiosity. What lesson would this boy take from today? That you could hurl hate at someone and they would just take it. Or that there was a better way to handle conflict. Lieutenant Parker was trying to guide Thornton away, but the man kept turning back toward Thomas, shouting over the officer's shoulder, "Your kind doesn't belong here. This isn't your country." A woman in the crowd shouted back, "Shut up, you drunk fool." Others joined in, telling Thornton to leave, to show some respect. Thomas felt a bead of sweat run down his back under the heavy wool uniform. The sun was directly overhead now, beating down on his black bearskin hat. His legs ached from standing motionless for hours. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the weight of the decision he was considering. Breaking protocol could end his career. Everything he'd worked for, sacrificed for, could be lost in an instant. Yet standing there, taking the abuse silently, felt like a betrayal of something equally important. He remembered his training instructor's words. The hardest part of this job isn't standing still, it's knowing when movement matters. Thomas made his choice. With the slightest motion, almost imperceptible to those not looking for it, he caught Lieutenant Parker's eye and gave a tiny nod. The lieutenant had known Thomas for 3 years. He had selected him personally for the Royal Guard, impressed by not just his military record, but his character. He saw the nod and understood its meaning immediately. Parker hesitated for just a second, then gave an equally subtle nod in return. Permission granted. The crowd fell silent as Thomas moved for the first time in hours. It wasn't a dramatic movement, just a slight shift in stance, turning his head precisely 45 degrees to look directly at Thornton. The motion was so unexpected, so contrary to everything people knew about the Royal Guards, that everyone froze. Even Thornton stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open in surprise. For 6 long seconds, Thomas simply looked at the man, not with anger or hatred, but with a steady gaze that seemed to see right through him. Then, breaking over 300 years of tradition, Thomas Wilson spoke while on duty. His voice was calm and clear, carrying across the courtyard without him having to raise it. The words he chose would soon be repeated in news reports, shared in social media posts, and discussed in living rooms across the country. What he said next left everyone, Lieutenant Parker, the gathered tourists, and especially Robert Thornton, completely stunned. "Sir," Thomas said, his voice steady and clear despite not having spoken for hours, "I stand here today not just for myself, but for every citizen of this country, including you." The crowd went completely silent. Even the birds seemed to stop chirping. Thornton's mouth hung open, his next insult forgotten. "My grandfather arrived here in 1956 from Jamaica," Thomas continued. "He cleaned hospital floors for 30 years. My father served in the British Army for 2 decades. I've worn this uniform for 6 years and stood guard at this palace for 3. Thomas's eyes never wavered from Thornton's face. "This uniform represents centuries of history that belongs to all of us who call this nation home. Your words cannot diminish that honor, nor can they change the fact that I've earned my place here." A woman in the crowd gasped. Someone else whispered, "Is he allowed to do that?" Lieutenant Parker stood perfectly still, his face giving nothing away. This was unprecedented, a Royal Guard breaking formation to speak, but he had given his silent permission. Now he watched, along with everyone else. "I do not stand here because of what you call diversity," Thomas said, his voice gaining strength but never losing its calm dignity. "I stand here because I met the same standards as every guard before me. The same tests, the same trials, the same oath to serve and protect." Thornton's face had drained of color. The anger in his eyes was fading, replaced by something else. Confusion, perhaps even shame. "You speak of belonging," Thomas said. "Let me tell you what belonging means to me. It means that when my grandfather was mopping hospital floors, he was doing it for everyone who walked those halls, regardless of their color or where they came from. It means that when my father put on his uniform, he was ready to give his life for everyone in this country, even those who might not welcome him to their dinner table." Thomas paused, letting his words sink in. The silence in the courtyard was complete now. Even those who had been filming had lowered their phones, too caught up in the moment. And it means that when I stand here today, I stand for everyone who passes by. For the children who look up at me with wonder. For the elderly who remember what these gates have seen through the years. For visitors from around the world. And yes, sir, even for you. A tear slid down the cheek of an older woman in the crowd. A father lifted his young daughter onto his shoulders so she could see better. You asked where I'm from, Thomas said, his voice softening slightly. I'm from South London, born at St Thomas Hospital, raised on Canterbury Estate, educated at Westbridge Academy. My blood and sweat and tears have soaked into the same soil as yours. This is my home. This is where I belong. Thomas straightened his shoulders, somehow standing even taller than before. And now, with respect, sir, I must ask you to move along. You're disrupting the peace of a royal residence, and that's something I'm sworn to prevent. For a long moment, Thornton just stood there, swaying slightly. The alcohol in his system seemed to be fighting with the sobering effect of Thomas's words. Finally, he opened his mouth to speak, but instead of another insult, what came out was barely audible. I didn't. But he never finished his sentence. From somewhere in the crowd, a slow clap began. A single person at first, then another joining in and another, until the entire courtyard filled with applause. Thornton looked around, suddenly aware that he was the villain in this scene, not the hero he'd imagined himself to be. With a final confused glance at Thomas, he turned and stumbled away, disappearing into the crowd. As the applause continued, Thomas resumed his position, eyes forward, expression neutral, as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened. Every person who witnessed it knew they had seen something extraordinary. Lieutenant Parker stepped closer to Thomas and spoke quietly. Wilson, report to my office when your shift ends. Thomas gave a slight nod, betraying no emotion. He had no idea if he just ended his career or done something his commanders would understand. All he knew was that for the first time since putting on the uniform, he felt truly worthy of wearing it. The crowd began to disperse, many lingering to take one last look at the guard who had said what needed to be said. The little boy who had watched it all tugged at his mother's hand. Mom, he said loudly in the way children do, when I grow up, I want to be just like him. By nightfall, Thomas's face was everywhere. A tourist from Canada had uploaded the video to her social media account, and within hours it had spread across the internet like wildfire. News channels played clips of the moment over and over. Guard Bereikes Silency read the headline on one website. DGITY under fire, proclaimed another. Thomas knew none of this as he finished his shift. His mind was on the meeting with Lieutenant Parker. As he changed out of his ceremonial uniform in the guard's quarters, his fellow guardsmen watched him with a mix of awe and concern. Never seen anything like that before, said Anthony, his bunkmate of 2 years. Reckon you're in for it with Parker. Thomas folded his red tunic carefully. Probably. Don't know what came over me. I do, said Greg, an older guard who rarely spoke. Backbone. That's what came over you. The walk to Parker's office felt longer than usual. Thomas passed the framed photographs of royal guards from decades past, their faces stern, their postures perfect. Had any of them ever broken protocol? What had happened to them afterward? He knocked on the heavy wooden door. Enter, came Parker's voice from inside. The office was small but neat, with a window overlooking the palace gardens. Lieutenant Parker sat behind his desk, reading something on his computer screen. He didn't look up immediately. Sir, Guard Wilson reporting as ordered. Parker finally raised his eyes. His expression gave nothing away. Sit down, Wilson. Thomas sat, his back still straight, hands resting on his knees. You know why you're here, Parker said. It wasn't a question. Yes, sir. I broke protocol. I spoke while on duty. Parker leaned back in his chair. In 300 years, Wilson, Royal Guards have broken formation only for emergencies. Never to respond to a heckler. Never to make a speech. Never to. He gestured vaguely with his hand. I understand, sir. I accept whatever consequences. I'm not finished, Parker interrupted. He tapped his computer screen. Do you know what this is? Thomas shook his head. This is an email from my superior, and his superior is copied on it, and her superior too. All the way up the chain. Parker's face remained unreadable. Would you like to know what it says? Thomas swallowed hard. Yes, sir. Parker picked up the email and read aloud. Request immediate report on the incident at North Gate involving Guard Wilson. Video has reached the highest levels of palace administration. He set the paper down and stared at Thomas. So tell me, what am I supposed to put in this report? The truth, sir. I failed to maintain protocol. I allowed a civilian's words to provoke a response. Parker nodded slowly. Yes, that's one way to see it. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening gardens. Another way is that you showed extraordinary restraint for 6 full minutes while being verbally assaulted. That you requested permission, through proper channels, I might add, before speaking. And that when you did speak, you represented this institution with more dignity than that uniform has seen in quite some time. Thomas blinked in surprise. Sir, I've been in this position for 8 years, Wilson. I've seen guards faint from the heat without moving a muscle. I've seen them stand perfectly still while pigeons use their hats as toilets. But I've never seen anyone handle what you faced today with such humanity. Outside the office, a phone rang. Voices murmured in the hallway. The thing is, Wilson, Parker continued, sitting back down at his desk, rules exist for a reason. We can't have guards chatting with tourists or responding to every drunk fool who wanders by. I understand, sir. But rules without judgment become tyranny, and what you showed today was judgment. Parker leaned forward. The question is, what do we do now? Before Thomas could answer, there was a knock at the door. Come in, Parker called. A young assistant entered, looking nervous. Sorry to interrupt, sir, but the captain of the guard is on the phone. He says it's urgent. Parker nodded. I'll take it. He picked up his desk phone, and as he listened, his eyebrows rose slightly. Yes, sir. He's with me now. I understand. Yes, sir. Right away. He hung up and looked at Thomas with new respect in his eyes. It seems, Wilson, that your video has reached even higher than I thought. The Palace Communications Office has been flooded with messages. And he paused, as if still processing what he just heard. The royal family has taken notice. Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. The royal family, sir? Parker nodded. It appears that His Majesty watched the video himself, and he has. Parker cleared his throat. He has expressed his admiration for your conduct. Thomas sat perfectly still, just as he'd been trained to do, but inside, his thoughts were racing. The king had seen what he did, had approved. So, Parker said, a hint of a smile finally breaking through his professional demeanor, it seems we won't be discussing disciplinary action after all. Instead, you've been requested to attend a special meeting tomorrow at St. James's Palace. A meeting, sir, with whom? Representatives from the palace's diversity initiatives. It seems your handling of today's incident has presented an opportunity to address some long-standing issues within the institution. Thomas nodded, still trying to process everything. You're dismissed, Wilson, Parker said. Get some rest. I suspect tomorrow will be quite a day. As Thomas walked back to the guard's quarters, his phone buzzed in his pocket. 17 missed calls. 43 text messages. His oldest friend had written, Mate, your EVAR. Call me. Thomas put the phone away. He wasn't ready to see what the world was saying about him just yet. For now, he just wanted a moment to breathe, to think about what had happened and what might come next. Back in the empty changing room, he sat on a bench and finally let his shoulders relax. For the first time since that morning, he smiled. The meeting room at St. James's Palace was nothing like Thomas had imagined. Instead of cold grandeur, it was surprisingly cozy, with comfortable chairs arranged around a polished table. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating paintings of landscapes that hum on the wood-paneled walls. Thomas tugged at the collar of his dress uniform. Despite facing drunk tourists and standing for hours in summer heat, this was the most nervous he'd ever felt. Relax, said Lieutenant Parker, who had accompanied him. You're not on trial here. Before Thomas could respond, the door opened. In walked a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes. Guard Wilson, she said, extending her hand. I'm Catherine Wells, Royal Household Diversity Advisor. Thank you for coming. Thomas shook her hand, surprised by her warm greeting. 3 other people followed her into the room. a tall man in a crisp suit who introduced himself as the palace communications director, a younger woman who was apparently from the royal press office, and an older gentleman with a military bearing who turned out to be General Richards, the head of the Royal Guard. "Please sit," Catherine said, gesturing to the chairs. "I suspect you're wondering why we've called you here." Thomas sat stiffly, his cap resting on his knee. "Yes, ma'am." Catherine smiled. "First, let me assure you that you're not in any trouble. Quite the opposite, in fact." She glanced at General Richards, who nodded for her to continue. "What happened yesterday has created quite a stir," she said. "The video of your response has been viewed over 10 million times. It's been shared by members of Parliament, celebrities, and ordinary citizens alike. You've struck a chord, Guard Wilson." "I wasn't trying to create a stir, ma'am," Thomas said quietly. "I just spoke from the heart." "And that's precisely why it resonated," said the communications director. "In an age of carefully crafted statements, people recognized something authentic in your words." General Richards cleared his throat. "While breaking protocol is not something we typically celebrate," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind, "exceptional circumstances sometimes call for exceptional responses. Your commanding officer has provided a full report of the incident, and we believe you acted with the highest degree of professionalism under difficult circumstances." Thomas relaxed slightly, so he really wasn't going to be disciplined. Catherine opened a folder on the table. "We've received hundreds of messages about you, Guard Wilson. Families writing to say that they showed your video to their children as an example of dignity under pressure. Schools asking if you would consider speaking to their students. And most surprisingly," she smiled, "we've received a significant increase in inquiries about joining the Royal Guard, particularly from young people from minority backgrounds." Thomas blinked. "Because of me?" "Because of you," she confirmed, "which brings us to why you're here today. We believe your experience presents an opportunity, not just for good publicity, but for meaningful change within the institution." The press office representative spoke up. "His Majesty has taken a particular interest in this matter. He believes that the Royal Guard should reflect the diversity of modern Britain while maintaining its traditions of excellence and dignity. Exactly what you demonstrated, Guard Wilson." "So what happens now?" Thomas asked. Catherine leaned forward. "We'd like to invite you to participate in a new initiative. With your permission, we want to feature your story as part of a campaign to encourage more diverse recruitment in the Royal Guard and other royal institutions." "We're not asking you to become a poster boy," General Richards added quickly. "You're a soldier first and foremost, but your voice, when you choose to use it, carries weight." Thomas thought about his grandfather, who had faced far worse discrimination without the benefit of viral videos or palace meetings. He thought about the little boy in the crowd who said he wanted to be like him when he grew up. "I'd be honored to help," he said finally, "but I have one condition." The others exchanged glances. "What's that?" asked Catherine. "I want to meet with the man who confronted me, Mr. Thornton." Surprised looks went around the table. The communications director frowned. "Is that wise? The man hurled racial abuse at you." Thomas nodded. "Yes, he did. And if this is truly about meaningful change, then it has to include people like him too. Otherwise, we're just talking to people who already agree with us." A silence fell over the room. Then General Richards let out a short laugh. "Lieutenant Parker was right about you, Wilson. You do have exceptional judgment." Catherine made a note in her folder. "We'll see what we can arrange. In the meantime, there's someone else who would like to meet you." As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. Catherine stood quickly, as did everyone else in the room. Thomas followed suit, confused until the door opened and a familiar face appeared. One he had only ever seen on currency and in official portraits. Thomas snapped to attention, heart pounding. "Your Majesty," everyone said in unison. The king smiled as he entered. "At ease, everyone. Especially you, Guard Wilson. I believe you've been standing at attention quite enough lately." Thomas could hardly believe what was happening. The king himself had come to meet him. As they talked for the next 15 minutes about duty, dignity, and the changing face of Britain, Thomas thought about how far he had come from that small flat in South London, and about how sometimes breaking the rules in just the right way could change everything. 1 year later, Thomas sat in a small coffee shop near Victoria Station, The place was quiet, just a few customers typing on laptops or reading newspapers. He checked his watch. It was almost time. The bell above the door jingled, and a man walked in. He was thinner than Thomas remembered, his face no longer flushed with alcohol but pale with nervousness. Robert Thornton scanned the room until his eyes landed on Thomas. For a moment, he seemed to consider turning around and leaving. Then, taking a deep breath, he walked over. "Guard Wilson," he said, his voice much quieter than it had been that day at the palace. "Just Thomas is fine," Thomas replied, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "I'm not on duty." Thornton sat down awkwardly. "I wasn't sure you'd really be here." "I said I would be." The waitress came over. Thomas ordered another coffee. Thornton asked for tea. Neither spoke until their drinks arrived. "Thank you," Thornton finally said, staring into his cup, "for agreeing to meet me. I wouldn't have blamed you if you'd said no." Thomas shrugged. "I believed you when you said you wanted to talk." It had taken months to arrange this meeting. After the palace incident, Thornton had been identified by social media users within days. He'd lost his job as an accountant, received death threats, eventually checked himself into a rehab program for his drinking. 3 weeks ago, he'd written to Thomas through the Royal Guard's Public Affairs office asking if they could meet. Not for publicity, there were no cameras here, no journalists, but for something more personal. "I've been sober for 8 months now," Thornton said. "My therapist says I should make amends to people I've hurt. But this isn't about me feeling better. I just want you to know I'm truly sorry for what I said that day." Thomas nodded. "What made you say those things?" Thornton winced at the direct question. "I'd like to blame it all on the alcohol, but that would be a lie. The drink just brought out what was already there." He paused. "I grew up in a different England. My dad was old-fashioned, you might say. Had certain views about who belonged here and who didn't. And you believed him." "I never questioned it. Then the world changed, and I felt left behind. Lost my job to downsizing. Marriage fell apart. Started drinking too much." Thornton shook his head. "But that's no excuse." A group of schoolchildren walked past the window, their teacher guiding them toward what was probably a museum trip. Thomas watched them, all colors and backgrounds, laughing together. "You know what happened after that day?" Thomas asked. Thornton looked up. "I saw some of it on the news. You became famous." Thomas smiled slightly. "Not just that. Applications to join the Royal Guard increased by 32%, and applications from people of color went up by over 70%. Because of what you said, because they saw someone who looked like them standing there, being part of something they might not have thought was for them." Thomas took a sip of his coffee. "Your horrible moment became something positive for a lot of people." Thornton looked genuinely surprised. "I never thought of it that way." "That's why I wanted to meet you," Thomas said. "To tell you that. I don't deserve your forgiveness. This isn't about what you deserve. It's about moving forward." Thomas leaned forward. "You know what I remember most about that day? Not what you said to me. What I saw in your eyes afterward. Recognition. Like you suddenly realized I was a real person." Thornton nodded slowly. "I did. When you spoke, it was like waking up from a bad dream where everyone was a cardboard cutout. Suddenly, there was a human being in front of me, not just a uniform or a category." They talked for another hour. About Thornton's childhood in Northern England. About Thomas's new role as a sergeant mentoring younger guards. About the changes happening in the Royal Guard, small but meaningful steps toward making the institution more reflective of modern Britain while preserving its traditions. As they were preparing to leave, Thornton asked, "Do you think things are really changing? In the big picture?" Thomas considered the question. "My grandfather used to say that change isn't something that just happens one day. It's built one conversation, one moment, one person at a time." He stood up. "So yes, I think things are changing. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to matter." Outside the coffee shop, they shook hands. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No cameras captured it. No crowd applauded. Just two men acknowledging each other's humanity on a regular Tuesday afternoon. "Will I see you on the news again?" Thornton asked. Thomas smiled. "I'm speaking at schools now, telling kids they can be part of institutions they might think aren't for them. and I'm helping with recruitment training, working from the inside. Good luck with it all, Thornton said sincerely. You too, with staying sober with everything. As Thomas walked toward the underground station, his phone buzzed with a message from Lieutenant Parker, now Captain Parker, about tomorrow's meeting with new recruits. Among them would be a young woman from Birmingham who'd said in her interview that she decided to apply after seeing a video of a Royal Guard who looked like her, speaking up with dignity. Thomas smiled to himself. One conversation, one moment, one person at a time. Some days, that was enough to change the world.